A few years ago, a congregant of ours went through the beautiful and excruciating experience of being with her mother when she died. If you ever sat by the bedside of a beloved person at the end of their life, then you know that it rarely goes as you had hoped or imagined, and that there are always ways in which the experience takes you by surprise. Death is almost never straightforward, and it can be very hard in those final days and weeks to hold on to the faith that God is with you when someone you love is suffering. That was the experience of this congregant as her mother's final days stretched on. She didn't want her mother to go, and yet she didn't want to see her in so much discomfort. And the agony of that liminal and uncertain place was almost too much for her to bear. Why would a loving and compassionate God want the end of her mother's life to be so painful? How could she hold on to her faith in the face of this stark reality? And most importantly, where was God? I talked on the phone with her at that time, and I shared with her that I don't believe that God is controlling the suffering or joy of our human experiences. I don't think that's how God moves through the world. For me, God is a presence that I call upon in my grief and in my exaltation to be with me, to hold me up, and help me move through the very painful and extraordinary experience of being human. I did not believe that God wanted her mom's death to be long and difficult, but I did believe that she could invite God into the room next to her to be another presence holding them up with grace and compassion. So this is what she did. She went back into her mother's room, held her close, and asked God to please be with them as they moved through the end of her mother's life, no matter what it looked like. And then her mother died in her arms, held by her love and her body and by the presence of the Holy One by their side. Where is God when we're feeling lost and afraid? Where is the comfort we are seeking when reality as we know it continues to shift and change beneath us? How can we feel less alone, especially now, as so many of us are spinning, reconsidering our values and desperately needing help to recover from the hardest collective year and a half of our lives? Where is God right now? In his recent book entitled Judaism for the World, Jewish mystical scholar Arthur Green writes with poignancy and wisdom about our deep longing for God's presence at important moments in our lives. To be human, he writes, is to be distant from God, so very distant as one end of the world is from the other. Our deepest desire, our greatest need is to stare into the divine face, to drink at the deep well of God's presence. Yet we cannot do so. We cannot come any closer than we have. Every prayer we utter, every time we say the vital word you in prayer, proclaiming God our beloved, we are also confirming our separation from the one that we hope would, and on some level does, embrace us all. The longing itself, the Hasidic masters understood, can serve as a bridge between our distance from God and our renewed intimacy. The Hasidic masters understood the pain of longing. They knew the experience of yearning for something that we cannot touch. And yet, they also taught that that very longing, which our congregant felt acutely as her mother lay dying, is not a sign of separation, but instead a bridge back to connection. What a comfort that what may feel like pain or loneliness is actually the first step towards the very connection we seek. The Torah reading that we're going to hear soon this morning, and that we of course read every Rosh Hashanah morning, is the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, a quintessential story about the interwoven relationship between pain and longing. But in communities where 2 days of Rosh Hashanah are observed, there is a different reading on the first day. It's the story of the birth of Isaac. And it's that story that kept rustling the pages of my Chumash this year in my search for God in our fractured and unstable world. It was not Isaac or Abraham or even Sarah and her laughter who called out to me, but Hagar, mother of Yishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. Hagar, much like Vashti in the Purim story, usually gets passing attention, despite the fact that her story and her yearning for God are unique among not just the women of the Torah, but among all of the characters whose stories we read every year. So, Hagar. Hagar is an Egyptian woman who is enslaved to Sarah and who Sarah gives to Abraham in order to produce an heir for them because she and Abraham have not been able to conceive. When Sarah discovers that Hagar is pregnant, she cannot bear the envy, and she complains to Abraham that she herself has become diminished in Hagar's eyes because of her pregnancy. Sarah fears that Hagar no longer respects her. So Abraham tells her to do whatever she wants with the slave, and Sarah responds by abusing her. Hagar runs away and finds herself in that very wilderness that we talked about this morning, by a well, where an angel appears to her, directing her to return to Abraham and Sarah because her destiny is not to die in the desert, but to be the mother of a child and countless future offspring, who she is instructed by the angel to name Yishmael, God hears. And then an extraordinary thing happens. Hagar, abused slave, single mother, desperate and alone, gives God a new name. El Roi, the God who sees me. Her son will be named Yishmael, God hears, and her own name for God is God who sees. She may be alone and afraid, but just the names surrounding her suggest that she is very much in the presence of the holy. Hagar, from the word ger, stranger or wanderer, is the only person in the entire Torah to give God a new name. The only person. And the first woman to whom God speaks. El Roi, the God who sees me in the depth of my longing. Where is God, we ask? Sitting right in our very most vulnerable places. Fast forward several years, and God's promise to Abraham and Sarah comes true, and Isaac, our protagonist in this morning's story, is born. At his weaning feast, Sarah witnesses Isaac and Yishmael, the two brothers, playing together, and she demands that ha'amah hazot ve'et benah, that slave woman and her son, be cast out of the house. Though he does not want to send Hagar and his son into the desert alone, Abraham does. And once again, Hagar, who was seen by God, finds herself desperate and alone in the wilderness, with little water or food to sustain her and Yishmael. Inconsolable, Hagar leaves her child under a bush and walks away, unable to watch him die. Then God hears Yishmael's cry and sends an angel to comfort her, who addresses her not as that slave woman, but with her first name. Malach Hagar, al tir'i. What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the cry of the boy where he is, the angel says. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation out of him. Only then, after she has been reminded of God's presence, even in the depth of her brokenness, does God open her eyes and reveal that she has been sitting this whole time by a water well. She fills her skin, and Yishmael, the boy who was named for God being close to Hagar in her lowest hour, he drinks and lives. It would be tempting and also spiritually destructive to equate suffering with abandonment by God. Because then the opposite is true as well. Our success and happiness are a sign of God's imminent presence and care. But we all know that is not how the world works. It is also dangerous to think that longing or even pain are a sign of misalignment, because our lives are built upon resilience and the response to loss and suffering. We don't know who we are until we have stumbled and struggled and longed for things which we cannot have, because the substance of our worth is not born of our happy, easy moments, but of those moments when we wanted desperately to give up, but instead we found the strength to persevere. When we called out from our despair and we were rewarded, not with a return to the path we thought we were meant to live, but with the vision of a well of water where we can quench our thirst and survive yet another day. Shir Hama'alot Mima'akim Kraticha Adonai, the psalmist cries in Psalm 130, out of the depths I called to you, O God. Shim'a v'koli, hear my cry. The question in our darkest moments should not be, why has God done this to me? Because that leads to nowhere but more loneliness and desperation, and assumes that God is controlling our lives. No. The more helpful question is, as the Hasidic master said, how can I build a bridge out of my longing? How can I transform my isolation into seeds of comfort? How can I trust that God will even answer when I call? This last question is even more challenging to those who believe that God is found exclusively in the four walls of a synagogue. Does God come to us when we're alone in our suffering? As it turns out, the rabbis of the Talmud wrestled with this question too. Where is God found? In Brachot 6a, we find the following fascinating exchange between several of our sages. This is classic Talmud, so stay with me. It was taught in a baraita, the Talmud says, a teaching that's not found in the Mishnah. Abba Binyamin once said, one's prayer is only fully heard in a synagogue. Wait a minute, some of the other rabbis ask. How did you come to that conclusion? We need some proof text. That's what they'd like to do to each other. I need a little more than that. You can't just say that. So two other rabbis step in, and we read, Ravin Bar Rav Ada said that Rabbi Yitzchak said, from where is it derived that the Holy One, blessed be He, is located in the synagogue? As it is stated in Psalm 82, there's our proof text, God stands in the congregation of God. They turn to the Psalms and they say, look, right there it says the congregation of God is where people gather to sing God's praises, so that must be where God is found. And since we need a minyan to pray, that must mean that God is found among 10 people minimum. But then, like Abraham arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, the rabbis continue. But wait, what about when 3 judges gather to make a ruling? Is God there too, with just 3? Well, yes, they argue, God is. And they find another proof text, also in Psalm 82, as it is stated, in the midst of the judges, God judges. What about 2? From where is it derived that 2 who sit and engage in Torah study, the Shekhinah, the intimate divine presence, is with them? Is God with just 2 of us when we're together? As it is stated in Malachi, then they feared that the Lord spoke with one another, and the Lord listened. Are you following me? Okay, good. So the Shekhinah, the intimate divine presence of God, is also present for 2 people who engage deeply in Torah study together. So now we come to our question, what about 1? Will God listen when I call out alone? In fact, yes. And from where is it derived, the Talmud says, that when even 1 who sits and engages in Torah study, the divine presence is with him? As it is stated, and this is from Exodus, this proof text, in every place where I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come to you and bless you. The rabbis conclude that God blesses even a single person who mentions God's name. All it takes is an open and willing heart, and God will hear. Yishma El. El Roi, I asked our congregant to call out in Hagar's name that day, the God who sees me, can you see me now and help me through even this terrible moment, even as I sit with my most beloved one as she dies beside me? And God answered her, yes. Hagar, our teacher, the one whose name means the stranger and the wanderer, Her name also means the one who dwells, the one who embodies her experiences exactly as they are, the grief, the longing, the rejection, the love. The one who thinks that she's going to be abandoned in her loneliest hour, but who is instead rewarded with the promise of a future that even she cannot begin to imagine. In the moment that feels like her death, she discovers that it is actually her chance at rebirth. She understands in that moment that her liberation is actually born out of her suffering and that a new day, a new future has now been revealed to her. It is in these exchanges of human suffering and divine response that she finds the courage to rise up and grab Yishmael by the hand and take her first steps onto a bridge that leads not to communion with God, but to a safe place where she knows that God is always on the other side when she calls. And so in Hagar's name, I offer up these words of hope and blessing from Psalm 27, the psalm that symbolizes our high holiday journey. When difficulties arise, I have a hiding place in my one heart, a secret tent where I can go and feel safe, a rock to rest my head upon. May we take courage. May we be strong, friends. May our hearts be so filled with love that there is no room for anything else. Amen.